Motivating operations are environmental variables that help explain why behavior changes from moment to moment, even when the same consequences are available. From a behavior analytic perspective, behavior is not driven solely by reinforcement histories. The same consequence can be highly effective at one time and relatively ineffective at another. Motivating operations account for this variability by describing conditions that alter both the value of consequences and the current likelihood of behavior that has produced those consequences in the past. Early behavioral accounts use terms such as drive to describe these effects, but later analyses emphasize observable environmental operations rather than inferred internal states. This shift allowed motivation to be analyzed functionally in terms of measurable variables like deprivation, satiation, and aversive stimulation. Motivating operations capture the idea that behavior depends not only on what consequences are available, but also on whether those consequences matter at that moment. By identifying these variables, behavior analysts can more accurately predict when behavior will occur and understand fluctuations in responding that could not be explained by reinforcement alone. Behavior does not occur uniformly across time. Even when reinforcement is consistently available, people do not want the same things all the time, and actions that produce specific outcomes vary depending on current conditions. The value of a stimulus can change as other environmental factors change, sometimes rapidly. A consequence may be available, but behavior may still not occur if that consequence is not currently effective as a reinforcer. This distinction highlights a limitation of relying exclusively on reinforcement to explain action. Motivation involves conditions that momentarily increase or decrease the effectiveness of consequences and the behaviors related to them. From a behavior analytic standpoint, saying that someone wants something implies two things. The outcome would function as a reinforcer at that time, and that behaviors previously reinforced by that outcome are more likely to occur. Understanding what drives behavior therefore requires identifying the environmental variables that alter these relations, rather than appealing to vague or internal explanations. A clear understanding of motivating operations depends on precise terminology. A motivating operation refers to any environmental variable that alters the effectiveness of a stimulus as a reinforcer or punisher and changes the current frequency of behavior related to that stimulus. Establishing operations increase the effectiveness of a consequence, whereas abolishing operations decrease it. These value-altering effects are paired with behavior-altering effects. An evocative effect refers to an increase in behavior that has previously produced a consequence, while an abative effect refers to a decrease in such behavior. Motivating operations can be unconditioned or conditioned. Unconditioned motivating operations have value-altering effects without prior learning, whereas conditioned motivating operations acquire their effects through learning history. Subtypes of conditioned motivating operations include surrogate, reflexive, and transitive forms, each defined by how the motivating effect is established and how it alters behavior. These terms provide the conceptual foundation for analyzing motivation in observable functional terms. Motivating operations are foundational concepts within behavior analysis and are explicitly reflected in professional competency standards. Practitioners are expected to define motivating operations and use them when designing and evaluating behavior change procedures. This includes understanding how motivating operations interact with discriminative stimuli and consequences to influence behavior. Mastery of these concepts allows practitioners to explain why behavior varies across contexts and time, even when intervention procedures appear unchanged. Learning objectives associated with motivating operations include distinguishing among different types of motivating operations, explaining their value-altering and behavior-altering effects, and applying these concepts in intervention design. Another critical objective is differentiating motivating operations from discriminative stimuli. As these variables influence behavior through different mechanisms, competence in this area supports accurate assessment, effective intervention planning, and ethical practice, particularly when addressing problem behavior or teaching new skills in applied settings. Motivating operations were developed to replace earlier, less precise explanations of motivation that relied on inferred states. And an establishing operation was originally defined as an environmental variable that momentarily changes both the effectiveness of a reinforcer and the frequency of behavior that has produced that reinforcer. The broader term motivating operation was later introduced to account for variables that can either strengthen or weaken the value of consequences. A motivating operation is defined by two simultaneous effects. The value altering effect refers to changes in how effective a stimulus, object, or event is as a reinforcer or punisher. The behavior altering effect refers to changes in current frequency of behavior that has been reinforced or punished by that stimulus. These effects are momentary and depend on current environmental conditions. By focusing on observable operations rather than hypothetical constructs, motivating operations provide a functional framework for analyzing motivation within behavior analysis. A motivating operation is defined by two distinct simultaneous effects on behavior. The first is the value altering effect, which refers to changes in how effective a stimulus, object, or event is as a reinforcer. When effectiveness increases, the motivating operation is called an establishing operation. When effectiveness decreases, it's called an abolishing operation. The second defining feature is the behavior altering effect, which refers to changes in the current frequency of behavior that has been reinforced by that stimulus. An evocative effect involves an increase in such behavior, whereas an abative effect involves a decrease. These effects are not limited to response frequency alone. Other dimensions of behavior, including response magnitude, latency, and relative frequency, may also be altered. Together, these two effects explain why behavior increases or decreases even when reinforcement histories remain unchanged. Motivating operations therefore play a critical role in understanding momentary fluctuations in behavior. Food deprivation and ingestion provide clear illustrations of motivating operations. When food deprivation is in effect, the value of food as a reinforcer increases, and behaviors that have previously produced food are more likely to occur. This includes actions such as searching for food or engaging in behaviors that have resulted in food access in the past. Food deprivation therefore functions as an establishing operation with an evocative effect. In contrast, food ingestion decreases the effectiveness of food as a reinforcer and reduces the frequency of behaviors that have been followed by food reinforcement. In this case, food ingestion functions as an abolishing operation with an abative effect. These changes are described as momentary because they persist only while the relevant conditions are in effect. As food is consumed, the effects of deprivation weaken, which is reflected in both reduced reinforcer value and decreased food-seeking behavior. Terms such as hunger and thirst are often used to describe changes in behavior related to deprivation. But from a behavior analytic perspective, these terms are unnecessary. They function as labels for physiological sensations rather than as explanatory variables. While such sensations may accompany deprivation, they do not explain behavior. Deprivation operations have direct observable effects on both the value of consequences and frequency of behavior. Referring to our internal states introduces intervening variables that can obscure functional analysis. Motivating operations allow behavior analysts to describe motivation without appealing to inferred processes. The effects of food deprivation, for example, can be observed directly in changes in reinforcer effectiveness and behavior, regardless of whether an individual can describe or is aware of physiological sensations. By focusing on environmental operations, behavior analysis maintains an emphasis on observable, measurable relations between conditions and behavior. Painful stimulation also functions as a motivating operation. Pain increases, the reduction or removal of pain becomes more effective as a reinforcer, and behaviors that previously produced pain reduction are more likely to occur. In this case, increased pain functions as an establishing operation with an evocative effect. Once pain is reduced or eliminated, the effectiveness of pain reduction as a reinforcer decreases, and behaviors associated with producing that reduction are less likely to occur. Decreased pain therefore functions as an abolishing operation with an ablative effect. As with other motivating operations, these effects are momentary and depend on current conditions. Pain related motivating operations illustrate that motivation is not limited to appetitive events such as food or water, but also includes aversive conditions that alter the effectiveness of escape or avoidance outcomes. Although value altering and behavior altering effects occur together, they can be conceptually distinguished. The value altering effect influences how potent a reinforcer is in strengthening future behavior. This can be observed by examining how changes in motivating operations affect the acquisition of new behavior. When a reinforcer is more effective, learning typically occurs more rapidly. The behavior altering effect, by contrast, refers to changes in current responding, even when reinforcement is not immediately delivered. Research has shown that different levels of deprivation can differentially evoke previously learned behavior, even under extinction conditions. These findings demonstrate that motivating operations can affect behavior independently of immediate reinforcement. Although these two effects often become difficult to separate once behavior contacts reinforcement, treating them as distinct allows for more precise analysis. This distinction clarifies how motivating operations influence both current performance and future impact of consequences.